An unassuming elderly woman walks into the bank unrecognized, and what should have been just a withdrawal for a party for her late husband's friends and family turns into a spectacle of humiliation. The manager who mistreats her has just started dating the elderly woman's own son, the owner of the whole establishment, and when the son discovers what his mother went through, no one goes unpunished. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The mansion stood imposing in the heart of the Upper East Side in New York City, with its wrought iron gates and gardens that once overflowed with life and laughter. Now, silence weighed like an invisible shroud over every room, every hallway, every object that held memories of happier times. Mrs. Eleanor Vance walked slowly through the spacious halls, her steps echoing on the cold. Marble and loneliness seemed to follow her like a faithful, unwelcome shadow. She had white hair tied in a simple bun, wrinkles that told stories of smiles and tears, and calloused hands that had never forgotten the humble work from which she came. Even surrounded by all that opulence, Mrs. Eleanor remained the same woman she had always been, the one who had met her Arthur when he was still a young dreamer, with nothing but determination and a heart as big as the world. Together, they had built not just a financial empire, but a life full of purpose, love, and a commitment to those who had less. It had been almost 3 years since Arthur had passed. 3 years since that man, admired by so many and respected in every corner of the country, had closed his eyes for the last time in the bed where they had slept together for over 40 years. The pain of his absence was still as fresh as a wound that refused to heal. Every morning, Mrs. Eleanor would wake up expecting to hear his deep voice calling her for coffee, to smell his sandalwood cologne, to see that warm smile that could light up any room. But she only found the emptiness, that constant companion that had taken the place of the love of her life. Her son, Robert Thompson, was all that was left of that time of completeness. A brilliant man, he had taken over Thompson Bank after his father's passing and transformed the institution into one of the most powerful financial conglomerates in the United States. Robert loved his mother with all the intensity of someone who recognizes her as the foundation of everything he had become. He called every day, sent flowers every week, ensured that nothing was lacking in that enormous house. But his obligations kept him tied to endless meetings, last-minute trips, decisions that couldn't wait. His visits grew rarer, Sunday lunches more spaced out. Mrs. Eleanor understood, of course she did. The business world was relentless, and her son carried on his shoulders not only the livelihood of hundreds of families, but his own father's legacy. Still, the loneliness hurt. It hurt when she sat at the immense dining room table, alone, looking at the empty chairs. It hurt when she wandered through the rooms that once housed the laughter of young grandchildren, now grown and busy with their own lives. It hurt most of all when she entered Arthur's office, that sanctuary preserved exactly as he had left it, with his pens organized, his books lined up, his leather armchair still holding the impression of his body. It was in that very office, on a rainy afternoon in June, that Mrs. Eleanor found the letter. She was looking for an old notebook where Arthur used to jot down recipes for cakes he loved to bake on weekends, a secret passion few knew about. As she opened a side drawer of the mahogany desk, her trembling fingers touched a yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax, hidden under a pile of old papers. Her heart pounded when she recognized her husband's firm, elegant handwriting. With trembling hands, Mrs. Eleanor broke the seal and carefully unfolded the pages. The words leaped from the paper as if Arthur were there, whispering in her ear. It was a letter written months before he passed, when he already sensed that time was running out. In it, Arthur spoke of his dreams for the bank, of the importance of never losing humanity amidst the numbers, of the commitment to use wealth to transform lives and not just accumulate power. But there were also worries, fears that the banking system could become a cold, cruel machine, capable of crushing the most vulnerable in the name of efficiency and profit. Mrs. Eleanor read and reread every word, feeling tears stream down her wrinkled face. It was as if Arthur were trying to tell her something, a loving warning about the direction things could take. And at the end of the letter, one sentence touched her deeply. Eleanor, my love, if you ever feel we have lost our way, do not be afraid to bring us back to the path. You have always been my moral compass, my living conscience. I trust you to protect not only our family, but all those who cross the path of what we built together." Those words ignited something within her, a flame that had been dormant under the ashes of grief. Mrs. Eleanor realized she had spent the last 3 years merely surviving, letting herself be consumed by longing, forgetting that she still had a purpose, that she could still honor Arthur's memory in an active and meaningful way. And that's when the idea came to her, as clear as a ray of sunshine breaking through heavy clouds. In 2 weeks it would be Arthur's birthday. He would have been 75. In all the previous years, Mrs. Eleanor had spent that day locked in her room, crying softly, sunk in painful memories. But this time would be different. This time she would throw a party, a grand celebration of his life and legacy. She would gather old friends, loyal partners, employees who had worked with Arthur from the beginning, all those who carried beautiful stories about that extraordinary man. It would be a tribute, yes, but also a gentle warning, a way to remind everyone, especially her Robert, of the values that had always guided the Thompson family. The decision brought a renewed energy to Mrs. Eleanor. She began planning every detail, discreetly calling old friends, contacting Arthur's favorite caterer, choosing the songs he loved. She wanted everything to be perfect, to be a special surprise for Robert too, who had been so tense lately, so absorbed in his work. Perhaps this celebration could reconnect him with his roots, remind him of where they came from and why they had fought so hard. To throw the party as she envisioned, Mrs. Eleanor would need cash. She had accounts and cards, of course, but she wanted to do things the old-fashioned way, go to the vendors in person, pay with cash in hand, feel useful and independent as she had always been. There was a significant amount of money in an old account, a reserve Arthur had left specifically for her to use as she wished, without needing to answer to anyone. It would be perfect. She could have called Robert, asked for someone from the bank to come to the mansion and handle everything, but no. Mrs. Eleanor wanted to go out, to breathe the city air, to feel alive and capable. Besides, the main headquarters of Thompson Bank was on Park Avenue, not far from there. Maybe she could even pop into her son's office for a few minutes, see him, and satisfy her longing without spoiling the surprise of the party. The idea excited her even more. On the chosen morning, Mrs. Eleanor dressed with the simplicity that had always defined her. A light, comfortable brown skirt, a beige cotton blouse, low-heeled shoes worn by time. She combed her white hair into the same bun as always and picked up the fabric handbag she had used for over a decade. She looked at herself in the entryway mirror and smiled for the first time in weeks. There she was, the same Eleanor as always, the woman who had sold vegetables at a market in Queens before meeting Arthur, who had never forgotten her humble origins. The driver offered to take her, but she gently refused, preferring to call a cab. She wanted to feel ordinary, anonymous, free from the pomp that had always made her uncomfortable. The taxi driver, a friendly middle-aged man, chatted animatedly during the ride, talking about the chaotic New York traffic, about prices that never stopped rising, about his children who studied at night while working during the day. Mrs. Eleanor listened with genuine attention, asking questions, showing real interest. Those stories touched her, reminding her that the world was full of people fighting for a better life, just as she and Arthur had fought decades ago. When the taxi pulled up in front of the imposing Thompson Bank building, Mrs. Eleanor felt a pang of anxiety mixed with pride. There it was, the materialization of her husband's dreams, a building of glass and steel that reflected the grey New York sky, a symbol of everything they had achieved together. She took a deep breath, thanked the driver with a generous tip, and walked toward the main entrance. The glass doors slid open automatically, and Mrs. Eleanor entered the vast, gleaming lobby. The white marble floor mirrored the modern lights on the ceiling, and dozens of people bustled about, some in elegant suits, others in casual clothes, all absorbed in their own worlds. She suddenly felt small, out of place in this environment that, although it belonged to her family, seemed so distant from her daily reality. Gazes began to fall upon her, curious at first, then suspicious. A short, elderly woman in simple, worn clothes, her white hair disheveled by the street breeze, a faded fabric bag hanging from her arm. In the eyes of those people accustomed to luxury and ostentation, Mrs. Eleanor was just another ordinary person, perhaps even poor, possibly confused, certainly out of place. Two uniformed security guards, arms crossed near the inner revolving door, exchanged meaningful glances. One of them, a tall young man with a serious expression, approached discreetly, following the old woman's every move with excessive attention. Mrs. Eleanor felt the weight of his stare, but tried to ignore it, walking toward the ATMs first, thinking she might be able to handle everything there. She couldn't. The system asked for passwords she didn't remember, offered confusing options on screens that flashed too quickly. She gave up after a few frustrated attempts and decided to find a human teller. She looked around, searching for guidance, and spotted a line for priority service. She headed there but was intercepted by a young female employee in a tight skirt and high heels. The young woman, without even asking what Mrs. Eleanor needed, gestured mechanically toward the regular line, which was longer and slower. Mrs. Eleanor tried to explain that she had an old account and needed to speak with someone about a significant withdrawal, but the employee was already attending to someone else, ignoring her completely. Resigned, the elderly woman went to the indicated line and waited her turn, feeling exhaustion begin to weigh on her legs. 40 minutes later, she finally reached the counter. The teller, a bored young man who barely looked up from his computer screen, asked in a monotone voice what she wanted. Mrs. Eleanor calmly explained that she had an old account and needed to make a considerable withdrawal for an important family event. The young man asked for her documents, and she handed him her ID and a bank card, yellowed with age. The teller frowned as he typed in the details. The screen was slow to respond, and when it did, he leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. He looked at Mrs. Eleanor, then at the screen, then back at her. His expression changed from boredom to suspicion. Without a word, he stood up and walked to a glass-walled office at the back, where a man in a navy blue suit was talking with other employees. Mrs. Eleanor watched as the teller showed something on a tablet screen, occasionally pointing in her direction. The man in the suit looked up, analyzing her from a distance, with an expression that mixed disbelief and irritation. It was Marcus Slade, the manager of that branch. Known for his explosive temper and boundless arrogance, Marcus had built a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He met targets, cut costs, and fired anyone he considered unproductive without a second thought. To him, the bank was a money-making machine, and people were just replaceable parts in that machine. His superiors loved his numbers, ignoring the recurring complaints about his abusive behavior. Marcus approached the counter with long strides, his chin held high, his narrowed eyes examining Mrs. Eleanor from head to toe. He stood next to the teller, crossed his arms, and spoke loudly enough for other customers and employees to hear. "Ma'am, you'll have to forgive me, but I need to understand something. You're saying you have an account here with a large sum and you want to make a considerable withdrawal. Is that right?" Mrs. Eleanor nodded calmly, maintaining her dignity despite his condescending tone. "Yes, sir. I have an old account left by my husband. I need access to the money to organize a family event. It's an amount that has been saved for some time." Marcus let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we get a lot of stories in here. People who invent rich relatives, fantasy inheritances, accounts that don't exist. The system here is showing an account, yes, but frankly, looking at you, it's hard to believe this money is really yours." Mrs. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She felt her cheeks flush, not with shame, but with restrained indignation. Around them, a few people stopped to watch the scene. Employees exchanged knowing glances, some already smiling discreetly, as if watching another bizarre episode of daily banking life. "I assure you the money is mine," Mrs. Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor that was starting to take over her hands. "My husband left this amount specifically for me. I can prove it if you check the proper documents." Marcus rolled his eyes dramatically. "Ma'am, look, I'll be honest with you, we don't have time to waste on far-fetched stories. This account that appears in the system, if it's even the one you're talking about, has a value too high for someone who comes in here dressed like this, without even a companion, wanting to withdraw it all at once. This looks like a scam, like fraud, like someone trying to pass themselves off as someone they're not." The humiliation burned like acid. Mrs. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She would not give that arrogant man the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She tried to speak again, but he cut her off with an impatient wave of his hand. "Look, I'm going to say something no one else has the guts to say. You're making this up. People who look like you don't have this kind of money, ma'am. And if they do, they don't walk around like this, looking like they just came from the market. Do you think we're fools?" Discreet laughter echoed around them. Two young employees leaning against a counter exchanged comments in low voices, but loud enough for Mrs. Eleanor to hear. Another crazy one trying to get attention. She probably saw the bank's name on TV and decided to try her luck. "The manager's right, she's not even wearing a wedding ring." Mrs. Eleanor looked at her hands. It was true. She hadn't worn a wedding ring for years. After Arthur's passing, she had taken it off in a moment of deep pain, unable to bear the weight of that symbol without the love it represented. She had kept it in a velvet box, along with the other jewelry she never wore, but that absence was now being used against her, as proof that she was lying, that she was making up stories. Marcus continued, fueled by the attention he was receiving. "You know what I think, Mum. I think you found some lost document, thought you could come in here and pull a scam, withdraw money that isn't yours. Lucky for us, we have a system. We know how to identify this kind of situation. Because look, if we went by appearance, you don't even look like you have a bank account, let alone a fat one like this." Every word was a stab. Mrs. Eleanor felt herself shrinking, as if the floor were opening up beneath her feet. This was her family's bank, the legacy of the love of her life, and here she was, being treated like a criminal, a fraud, a worthless person. The pain of humiliation mixed with a growing indignation. How had they come to this? How had the bank that Arthur built with so much love, with the intention of serving people, turned into this cold and cruel environment? She tried one more time. "Please, sir, I'm not lying. I can call my son. He can confirm everything. He works here, he can explain." Marcus let out another laugh, this time louder, crueler. "Oh, now the son works here. How convenient. Let me guess, is your son a director, the president, the owner of the bank, perhaps? You'll have to come up with something better than that." The laughter around them grew. The situation had become a spectacle, and Mrs. Eleanor was the unwilling protagonist of this public tragedy. She felt her legs grow weak, the room spin slightly. The humiliation was so great that her body was beginning to react, begging her to leave, to flee before her dignity was completely shattered. It was then that a soft voice cut through the hostile atmosphere. "Excuse me, are you all right, ma'am?" Mrs. Eleanor turned and saw a middle-aged woman wearing the blue uniform of the cleaning staff, holding out a cup of water toward her. Her face was kind, marked by the wrinkles of someone who had worked hard her whole life, but her eyes shone with a genuine compassion that contrasted violently with the cruelty around her. The cleaning lady, whose name was Josephine, had seen everything. She was finishing cleaning the nearby windows when she noticed the commotion around the counter. She heard the manager's words, saw the pain on the elderly woman's face, and something inside her revolted. It didn't matter who this woman was. No one deserved to be treated that way, with such a lack of respect and humanity. Marcus looked at Josephine with disdain. "Get back to your work, Josephine. This is none of your business." But Josephine didn't move. She remained there, holding the cup of water, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Eleanor with a tenderness the elderly woman hadn't found in that cold place. "Please have some water. You look like you need it." Mrs. Eleanor took the cup with trembling hands, and in that simple gesture, she felt something break inside her. The tears finally came, silent and heavy, streaming down her wrinkled face. They were not tears of weakness, but of gratitude for finding a shred of humanity in the midst of this nightmare. She drank the water slowly, feeling the cool liquid soothe the lump in her throat. Josephine moved closer, ignoring Marcus's furious glare. "Would you like me to call someone, a family member?" Mrs. Eleanor shook her head, still unable to speak without her voice trembling. Marcus took a step forward, positioning himself between the two women. "Josephine, I'm not going. To repeat myself, get back to your work now or you'll be in trouble." But something in Josephine's posture changed. For the first time in a long time, she lifted her chin and looked the manager directly in the eye. "With all due respect, Mr. Slade, but I'm not going to leave this lady alone while she's feeling unwell. It's the least amount of humanity anyone deserves." The silence that followed was thick. Marcus clenched his fists, his face flushed with anger. This insubordination, this challenge from a mere cleaning lady in front of customers and colleagues was intolerable. But before he could explode, Mrs. Eleanor gently placed her hand on Josephine's arm. "Thank you, my dear. Thank you for your kindness. But it's all right. I'm leaving now." Josephine helped her to her feet, offering her arm for support. Together, they walked slowly toward the exit, under the gazes of dozens of people. Some looked embarrassed, others indifferent, but no one moved to help or question what had happened. At the door, Mrs. Eleanor turned one last time. Her eyes met Marcus's, who was still standing there, arms crossed, a smirk of satisfaction on his face. She wanted to say something, to scream, to make that man understand the magnitude of the injustice he had committed. But not now. Not yet. Dignity demanded she leave with her head held high, even if her heart was in pieces. Outside, the fresh New York air had never felt so necessary. Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the breeze cool the heat of humiliation still burning on her cheeks. Josephine remained by her side, waiting for her to recover. "Are you sure you're all right, ma'am? Would you like me to call a taxi?" Mrs. Eleanor looked at this simple woman, who had risked her job to show a little humanity, and felt her heart ache. "I am, my dear, thanks to you. What is your name?" "Josephine, ma'am. Josephine Miller. Josephine." Mrs. Eleanor repeated the name, committing it to memory. "You were the only person in there who treated me like a human being. That is worth more than all the riches in the world." The two women looked at each other for a long moment, a silent communication of shared pain and mutual respect. Josephine needed to get back to work before her absence was noticed, and Mrs. Eleanor needed to process everything that had just happened. They said goodbye with a brief but intense hug, promising to see each other again. As the taxi took Mrs. Eleanor back to her mansion on the Upper East Side, she stared out the window without really seeing the city go by. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The humiliation still burned like a live fire, but there was also a growing determination, a righteous anger that was beginning to take shape. What she had suffered was not just a personal offense, it was a symptom of something much larger, a distortion of the values Arthur had cherished so much. His letter came back to her mind, the words echoing with renewed force. "Do not be afraid to bring us back to the path." Perhaps that was exactly what she needed to do. Not for revenge, not for wounded pride, but because this institution, which should honor her husband's memory by serving people with respect and dignity, had turned into something unrecognizable. And Josephine, that brave, kind woman who had offered water and compassion when everyone else offered only contempt. Mrs. Eleanor could not forget her, could not let her kindness go unrecognized, or worse, be punished by that cruel manager. Upon arriving home, Mrs. Eleanor locked herself in her room and finally allowed the tears to come with full force. She cried for the humiliation she had suffered, for the longing for Arthur that now seemed even more acute, for the fear that her son didn't know what was happening in the bank that bore the family name. But between the tears, a firm resolution began to form. This would not end here. It could not end here. In the days following that humiliating afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor couldn't shake the memory of what had happened. She would wake up in the middle of the night, reliving every cruel word, every look of disdain, every laugh that had echoed in the cold lobby of that bank. But along with the pain grew an almost physical need to act, to do something that would transform that devastating experience into something larger, something that could mean real change. Arthur's letter remained on her bedside table, and every morning she reread it, drawing strength from her husband's words. Those lines, written with so much love and wisdom, had become her guide, her reason, not to give up. But there was something else, a worry that gave her no peace. Josephine. Would that simple woman, who had risked her position to show compassion, be suffering consequences because of that gesture of humanity. The idea that Josephine might be punished for helping her tormented Mrs. Eleanor more than her own humiliation. For 3 consecutive nights, she barely slept, imagining terrible scenarios. What if the manager had fired her? What if he was persecuting her, making her job unbearable? Guilt weighed like a stone on her chest. She had to go back to the bank, not to withdraw the money now, but to make sure Josephine was okay, to thank her properly, and perhaps somehow to protect her from the reprisals she might be facing. 4 days after the incident, Mrs. Eleanor returned to Thompson Bank. This time, she dressed a little more carefully, choosing a simple but less worn outfit, and fastened her hair with a silver clip Arthur had given her decades ago. She didn't want to draw attention, but she also didn't want to seem completely invisible. Her goal was discreet, to find Josephine, talk to her, and maybe even finally make that withdrawal that had started it all. Upon entering the bank, the same familiar discomfort enveloped her. Curious glances, some even recognizing her from the embarrassing scene days before. Mrs. Eleanor held her head high, walking slowly through the lobby, her eyes searching for the familiar figure of the cleaning lady. She passed the counters, the lines, the waiting areas, but there was no sign of Josephine. That's when she spotted a side door leading to a service corridor. Discreetly, she headed there, pushing the door open carefully. The corridor was narrow, poorly lit, with grey walls that contrasted sharply with the luxury of the main lobby. This was where the cleaning supplies were stored, the support staff's locker rooms, those invisible spaces where the people who kept the bank running worked but were rarely seen or acknowledged. And it was there, arranging a cleaning cart, that Mrs. Eleanor finally found Josephine. The woman's face was tired, her shoulders slumped under a weight of fatigue that seemed to go beyond the physical. When her eyes met Mrs. Eleanor's, there was a flash of surprise followed by a shy but genuine smile. "Mrs. Eleanor, you came back." "I did, my dear. I couldn't stop thinking about you, wondering if you were all right after that day." Josephine looked around, making sure they were alone, and then gestured for Mrs. Eleanor to follow her to a small space with an old table and a few broken chairs. There, away from prying eyes and ears, the 2 women sat down, and Josephine finally relaxed her tense shoulders a little. "I was worried about you," Josephine confessed. "After you left, I kept thinking about what had happened, wondering if you were okay, but I was also afraid they might blame you because of me." "Mrs. Eleanor took Josephine's rough hands in hers. "You did nothing wrong, dear. On the contrary, you were the only person in that entire place who showed a shred of humanity, and I came here today precisely to thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. She had worked at that bank for almost 15 years. She had started as a cleaning assistant when her son Lucas was still small, and she needed any job to support their home alone. The boy's father had left when he learned of the pregnancy, leaving her without support, without a safety net, with nothing but her own determination to give her son a better life than she had had. Throughout all those years, Josephine had witnessed scenes of disrespect, arrogance, and cruelty. She had seen customers mistreated, employees humiliated, ordinary people treated as if they were worthless. But she had always kept her head down, doing her job in silence, because she needed that salary, however meager, to pay the rent, the food, Lucas's books, and school supplies. Her son was her pride, her reason for being. Lucas was 18 now, a senior in a public high school, and he dreamed of becoming a doctor. He was a brilliant, dedicated boy who studied late into the night, even after spending the day helping his mother with extra jobs she found on weekends. His grades were impeccable, and he had recently been accepted into a free college prep course, an achievement that filled Josephine with both hope and terror. Hope that his dream could become a reality, terror that she wouldn't be able to afford college if he got in. "Do you have children?" Josephine asked, discreetly wiping away her tears. "I have one son, yes, Robert. He's a wonderful, successful man who takes care of me as best he can. But sometimes I feel he's lost his way a bit, you know. His work consumes so much of him that sometimes it seems he's forgotten where he came from, what really matters." Josephine nodded in understanding. "I have a son too, Lucas, 18. He's my whole life, you know. Everything I do, every sacrifice I make, is for him, for his future. And there, in that humble, forgotten space of a luxurious bank, two mothers began to share their stories. Mrs. Eleanor spoke of Arthur, of the love that united them, of the life they built together, of the longing that never faded. Josephine spoke of Lucas, of the hardships of raising him alone, of the nightly fears of not being able to make it, of the small victories that kept her going. They were women from completely different worlds, yet united by something profoundly human, the unconditional love for their children and the desire to leave the world a little better than they found it. They talked for almost an hour, and Mrs. Eleanor felt something awaken within her that she hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine. Connection, true friendship, the kind of closeness that is born when two souls recognize each other as equals, regardless of external circumstances. Josephine, in turn, found in Mrs. Eleanor not just a confidant, but someone who saw her, who valued her, who treated her with the respect she so rarely received in that environment. But their conversation was abruptly interrupted when the corridor door swung open violently. A tall woman in towering heels and a tight suit entered with firm steps and a severe expression. It was Victoria Montgomery, supervisor of the customer service department and one of the most feared people in the bank. Victoria was 42 and had spent the last 15 years ruthlessly climbing the corporate ladder, stepping on anyone necessary to get higher. Her current goal was to become the regional manager, and for that, she needed to impress Marcus Slade and the directors above him. Victoria observed everyone and everything with a hawk's eye, always looking for flaws she could exploit, weaknesses she could use to her advantage. When she saw Josephine talking with the elderly woman, her first reaction was irritation. Cleaning staff shouldn't be wasting time chatting with anyone. But then she recognized Mrs. Eleanor from the scene days ago, and an idea began to form in her calculating mind. If that old woman had returned, it meant she was still trying to access that mysterious account. And if Josephine was getting close to her, maybe there was something there that could be used. Victoria didn't know what exactly, but her sharp instincts told her there was an opportunity. Perhaps she could use this situation to harm Josephine, whom she had always considered too proud for someone in her position, and at the same time score points with Marcus by demonstrating vigilance and protection of the bank's interests. "What is going on here?" Victoria's voice cut through the air like a blade. Josephine stood up immediately, her face pale. "Nothing, Miss Montgomery. I was just helping this customer here." "Helping? You should be working, not chattering. And you," Victoria turned to Mrs. Eleanor with ill-disguised contempt, "shouldn't you be in the lobby if you need service?" Mrs. Eleanor also stood up, sensing the tension in the air. "I was just talking with Josephine, who was very kind to me the other day." Victoria narrowed her eyes. "I see. Well, Josephine, get back to work. Now, and you, ma'am, please proceed to the lobby. This is not an area for customers." There was no choice but to obey. Mrs. Eleanor briefly touched Josephine's arm in a gesture of silent support and left the corridor, feeling Victoria's icy gaze burning into her back. When she reached the lobby, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Something about that woman had made her deeply uncomfortable, a bad feeling she couldn't explain. Meanwhile, in the service corridor, Victoria cornered Josephine against the wall, not physically but with the force of her position and authority. "Is this woman an acquaintance of yours?" "No, ma'am, I just helped her when she felt ill here at the bank a few days ago." Victoria crossed her arms. "You know that fraternizing with customers isn't part of your job, right? Especially with problematic customers who have already caused scenes here. But she didn't cause a scene, ma'am. It was Mr. Slade who—" Josephine fell silent immediately, realizing her mistake. She should never, ever have mentioned the manager. Victoria smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, so you're questioning the manager's actions now? Interesting. Very interesting. I think you'd better be careful, Josephine. This kind of attitude can have serious consequences. Get back to work, and stay away from that woman." Josephine nodded quickly and hurried away, her legs trembling. She knew Victoria well enough to know that this conversation would not end well. The supervisor was vindictive, and when someone fell into her crosshairs, they rarely emerged unscathed. What Josephine didn't know was that in another part of the bank, in a hidden room with security monitors, a young employee named Larissa was watching the whole exchange. Larissa worked in the IT department, responsible for keeping the surveillance systems running, and for the past few months, she had been witnessing things that deeply disturbed her. Larissa was 26, had graduated with a degree in computer science 3 years ago, and had gotten this job at the bank through sheer effort. At first, she was excited, believing she would be working in a serious and reputable institution. But gradually, she began to see the cracks in the perfect facade. She had seen Marcus mistreat employees, Victoria manipulate situations to harm colleagues, and witnessed clear cases of workplace harassment that were ignored by superiors because the aggressors met their financial targets. Twice she had tried to report irregularities through internal channels. The first time, she was ignored. The second time, she was called into a room and subtly threatened. Either she focused on her technical work and stopped meddling in matters that were none of her business, or she could look for a job elsewhere. Since then, Larissa had lived in a torturous internal conflict. She knew she should do something, that she had a moral responsibility to expose these abuses, but she also had bills to pay, a mother dependent on expensive medication, and the certainty that reporting again would mean losing her job. Now, watching the scene between Victoria and Josephine on the monitors, Larissa felt that familiar anguish grow in her chest. She recognized Mrs. Eleanor from the recordings of the previous week, when Marcus had publicly humiliated her. She had watched that scene with growing indignation, but had done nothing but archive the video as usual. And now, she saw Victoria clearly targeting Josephine, using that innocent conversation as a pretext for something. Should she do something? Should she tell someone? But who? The reporting channels were controlled by the same people committing the abuses, and if she lost her job, how would she take care of her mother? The dilemma consumed her, stealing her sleep, destroying her peace. Meanwhile, in the following days, Mrs. Eleanor returned to the bank twice more, not for the account or the money, but because she had formed a genuine bond with Josephine and wanted to nurture that unlikely friendship. They always met in the same service corridor, talked for a few stolen minutes between Josephine's tasks, and shared pieces of their lives like two old friends, separated by circumstances, but united by the heart. Mrs. Eleanor began to help Josephine in discreet ways. She brought homemade lunches, saying she had cooked too much and didn't want to waste it. She offered small gifts for Lucas, books she had found at home and no longer needed. Josephine, in turn, shared the real difficulties of her life, the constant fear of losing her job, the nights she cried in secret, thinking she would never be able to give her son the education he deserved. One day, during one of these conversations, Josephine finally revealed something that had been tormenting her. Lucas had been accepted into one of New York's best college prep courses, a partial scholarship that covered only half the tuition. The other half, though reduced, was an amount she simply didn't have. The boy was thinking of dropping out, of starting to work to help at home, of abandoning his dream of medicine. "You can't let him give up," Mrs. Eleanor said firmly. "That boy has a brilliant future ahead of him. You can't let circumstances destroy that." "But I don't know what to do, Mrs. Eleanor. I have nowhere to get that money, and worse, Mr. Slade has been looking at me differently since that day I helped you. I'm afraid he's looking for an excuse to fire me." Those words set off an alarm in Mrs. Eleanor's mind. Her worst fear was coming true. Josephine was paying the price for showing humanity. And now it wasn't just the injustice against herself that enraged her, but the real possibility that an upright woman and her brilliant son could have their lives shattered because of the cruelty of that arrogant manager. It was at that moment that Mrs. Eleanor made a decision. She could no longer just talk, just offer small comforts. She needed to act more significantly. She needed to tell Robert everything, to make him see what was happening in the bank that bore the family name, at the very foundations of the institution that Arthur had built with so much love and principle. But before she could put this plan into action, the situation worsened drastically. The following week, Marcus finally decided that Mrs. Eleanor's presence at the bank and her friendship with Josephine was a threat that needed to be eliminated. To him, this persistent, shabbily dressed woman was a problem, a constant reminder of his loss of control, and worse, she was contaminating Josephine with ideas that she had rights, that she deserved respect. Marcus called Victoria for a private meeting in his office. The supervisor entered with her usual calculated smile, already anticipating that something interesting was about to happen. "Victoria, we need to talk about Josephine," Marcus began, leaning back in his leather chair. "I've noticed she's been very distracted, talking with that problematic customer, not performing her duties properly." "I've noticed that too, sir. In fact, I was thinking of writing a report about it." "Excellent. I want you to document everything. Tardiness, poor work, insubordination, whatever you can find. We're going to build a case for termination with cause." Victoria felt a wave of satisfaction. She would finally have the opportunity to get rid of Josephine, who had always bothered her with that quiet dignity, that way of not letting herself be completely trampled. "Certainly, sir, I'll handle it personally." In the following days, Victoria began to harass Josephine relentlessly. She would show up unannounced to check her work, point out invisible imperfections, complain about perfectly clean bathrooms claiming they were dirty, and note any 5-minute delay as if it were a grave offense. Josephine felt increasingly cornered, the stress beginning to affect her health, the sleepless nights multiplying. And then, on a rainy afternoon in September, the worst happened. Marcus executed a plan he had been plotting for days. During Josephine's lunch break, while she had left her purse in her locker, he went in there with Victoria's complicity and planted 2 bundles of counterfeit bills inside her bag, old notes that had been taken out of circulation and that he kept in his office for situations just like this. When Josephine returned from lunch, she was intercepted by 2 security guards who, under Marcus's orders, asked to search her bag. Confused, she allowed it, and when they opened the bag and found the money, her world fell apart. Marcus emerged like an actor prepared for his moment of glory. He called all the ground floor employees, made sure there were witnesses, and publicly accused Josephine of stealing money from the bank. She tried to defend herself, swearing she had never seen that money before, that someone had planted it there, but her words were drowned out by the accusations. Marcus had everything planned, had already prepared Victoria's false reports, had already constructed a narrative where Josephine was a problematic and dishonest employee. The termination was summary. Josephine was escorted out of the bank like a criminal, under the gazes of shocked colleagues, curious customers, and the satisfied presence of Marcus and Victoria. Her tears flowed silently as she carried the box with her belongings, the humiliation burning deeper than any physical pain could. Outside, under the fine September rain, Lucas was waiting for his mother, as he did every day after his prep course classes. When he saw Josephine coming out like that, her face distraught and a box in her hands, his heart broke. He ran to her, held her tight as she cried on his shoulder, and in that moment he felt his world crumble. Not just for the lost job, but for the glaring injustice, for the certainty that he would have to abandon his dreams to work and help his mother. Inside the bank, in a dark monitoring room, Larissa watched everything on the monitors, her hands trembling with anger and helplessness. She had it all on tape. She had seen Marcus and Victoria enter the locker room, had seen the exact moment they planted the money in Josephine's bag. She had the perfect evidence of the crime they had committed, but what could she do with it? Reporting it would mean exposing herself, losing her job, perhaps even facing legal repercussions if Marcus decided to sue her for defamation. The dilemma paralyzed her. Would she save Josephine but destroy her own life, or would she protect herself and live forever with the guilt of having allowed this injustice? Larissa remained there, alone in that room, as the recordings continued to play on the monitors, the evidence of the truth pulsating on the screens, but chained by the fear. That held her motionless in her chair. And as the rain fell on New York City, 3 women carried their pains and their dilemmas. Josephine, humiliated and desperate, not knowing how she would survive the next month. Larissa, paralyzed between her conscience and her fear. And Mrs. Eleanor, who in her silent mansion was about to discover what had happened and make the most important decision of her life. Mrs. Eleanor found out what had happened in a way she never would have imagined. 2 days after Josephine's dismissal, she decided to return to the bank for her usual chat. with her friend, bringing an envelope with some money she planned to offer discreetly to help with Lucas's prep course expenses. She arrived at the service corridor as usual, but found another person cleaning there, a young woman who barely looked up as she passed. "Where is Josephine?" Mrs. Eleanor asked, her heart already beginning to race with a bad feeling. The young woman shrugged without stopping her work. "She was fired a couple of days ago. I think she stole money or something." The words fell on Mrs. Eleanor like a bucket of ice water. Stole Josephine, that honest, hard-working woman who lived for her son and sacrificed every day? Impossible. Absolutely impossible. The elderly woman felt her legs give way and had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. "What do you mean, fired? What happened exactly?" "I don't know the details, ma'am. I just know the manager found money in her bag and fired her on the spot. It was a huge scandal. Everyone saw it." Mrs. Eleanor stumbled out of there, her mind reeling. She needed to find out the truth. She needed to talk to Josephine to understand what had really happened, but she didn't have her phone number, didn't know where she lived, had no way to contact her. Desperation began to set in, mixed with a growing fury. If this had been a setup, if they had destroyed that woman's life because of her friendship with her, Mrs. Eleanor would never forgive herself. She spent the next 3 days trying to gather information, but everyone at the bank refused to talk about it. Employees averted their eyes when she asked. Security guards said they couldn't give out information about former employees. Finally, one afternoon, she managed to locate one of Josephine's colleagues who worked in the archives, a woman named Carmen who had always been kind. Carmen, after much insistence and promises of confidentiality, told Mrs. Eleanor everything. She spoke of how Marcus and Victoria had been harassing Josephine for weeks, how everyone at the bank knew the theft accusation was false, how Josephine had left there shattered, carrying a box of her belongings while her son cried by her side at the bank's entrance. The description of that scene broke Mrs. Eleanor's heart into a million pieces. Josephine had been publicly humiliated, accused of a crime she didn't commit, and her son had witnessed it all. Lucas's dream of becoming a doctor was likely destroyed now, with his mother unemployed and slandered. And all because of what? Because Josephine had had the courage to show humanity, to offer a glass of water to a mistreated old woman. Mrs. Eleanor left that bank for the last time before the storm that was to come, but this time she didn't leave crying. She left with a will of steel burning in her chest. The time had come to stop suffering in silence, to stop passively accepting injustice. The time had come to honor Arthur's words, to bring that institution back to the right path no matter the cost. That same evening, Mrs. Eleanor asked her driver to take her to Robert's apartment in a posh downtown neighborhood. It was almost 9 o'clock when she arrived, and her son was finishing dinner alone, still in his dress shirt but with his tie loosened, his face marked by the exhaustion of another grueling day. When the maid announced that his mother was there, Robert stood up immediately, concerned. Mrs. Eleanor rarely showed up unannounced. "Mom, what happened? Is everything okay?" He hugged her immediately, noticing the tension in her body. "I need to talk to you, Robert. It's important, very important." They sat in the spacious modern living room of the apartment, and Mrs. Eleanor began to tell her story. She spoke of her decision to go to the bank to withdraw money for the surprise party in honor of his father. She spoke of the humiliation she had suffered at the hands of Marcus Slade, of how she had been treated like a criminal, a fraud, a worthless person. Her voice trembled as she recalled that day, but she remained firm, determined to tell him everything. Robert listened in silence, but his face was transforming. The exhaustion gave way first to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally to pure fury. His mother? His own mother had been humiliated in the family's bank? By a manager he himself had helped promote 2 years ago because of his impressive financial results? With every word Mrs. Eleanor spoke, Robert felt shame and guilt grow inside him like a suffocating wave. But Mrs. Eleanor didn't stop there. She told him about Josephine, about the kindness of that simple woman, about how she had risked everything to show humanity. She told him about the friendship that had blossomed between them, about Lucas and his dreams, about the hardships Josephine faced every day. And then, with a voice heavy with pain and indignation, She told him about the cruel setup, about how Josephine had been fired under false accusations, about how her son had witnessed his mother being escorted out of the bank like a criminal. When she finished, the silence that fell over the room was thick and heavy. Robert was on his feet now, his hands trembling, his face flushed. He paced back and forth, unable to stand still, unable to fully process the magnitude of what he had just heard. "Mom, I don't know what to say. How did this happen? How did I let this happen?" "You didn't let it, son. You didn't know. But now you do. And now you have to act." Robert stopped pacing and looked at his mother. In her eyes, so much like Arthur's, he saw a mixture of pain, determination, and something more. A silent plea for him to be the man his father had raised him to be, the man who put principles above profits, people above numbers. "You're right. I need to fix this. I'll go there tomorrow morning. I'll fire this manager. No," Mrs. Eleanor interrupted, placing her hand on her son's. "Not like that. If you simply fire him, it will just be another dismissal, another manager replaced. The system remains the same, the culture remains the same. It needs to be different. It needs to be a clear message, not just for this bank, but for the entire organization." Robert sat down again, this time paying full attention. "What are you proposing?" "A surprise audit, a complete one. You, the board, all, the directors. You go to that branch unannounced, inspect everything, confront everyone, and I'm coming with you. I want to be there when the truth comes out. I want that man to know exactly who I am, who he mistreated. But more importantly, I want Josephine to receive justice, not just a phone call with an apology. Real justice, public, just as the humiliation was public." Robert looked at his mother with a mixture of admiration and sadness. There was the woman who had raised him, the same one who sold vegetables at the market when she met his father, the same one who never let herself be corrupted by wealth, the same one Arthur had loved until his last breath, precisely for that unwavering integrity. He nodded slowly. "All right. We'll do it your way." "But Mom," he hesitated, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry, truly, for not paying attention, for being so absorbed in work that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose. Dad would be ashamed of me." Mrs. Eleanor stood up, approached her son, and held his face in her hands, looking him in the eyes with tenderness. "Your father would be proud of the man you are, but he would also be happy to know that you still have time to correct your course. You are not responsible for that manager's bad choices, Robert, but you are responsible for what you do from now on." They spent the night planning every detail. Robert called the board members, convening an emergency meeting for the next morning at the headquarters. Mrs. Eleanor insisted that Larissa, the IT employee, should also be included. As Carmen had mentioned, she had access to the security recordings and might have evidence of what had really happened. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a small rented house on the outskirts of New York, Josephine and Lucas were living their darkest days. The severance pay would barely cover the back rent and basic bills. Josephine spent her nights awake, crying softly so her son wouldn't hear, sunk in a despair that seemed endless. The public humiliation meant that getting another job would be nearly impossible. Who would hire someone fired with cause for alleged theft? Lucas, for his part, was determined to drop out of his prep course and start working. He had already spoken to the owner of a nearby grocery store, who had offered him a job as a bagger. It wasn't much, but it would help. The dream of medicine would have to wait, perhaps forever. What mattered now was helping his mother, repaying some of what she had sacrificed for him over the years. Josephine tried to dissuade him, begging him not to give up his studies. But Lucas was as stubborn as she was. They had argued every night, and the tension in the small house was almost palpable. Josephine saw her son's dream crumbling and felt guilty, as if she were responsible for all the bad things that were happening. On the third day after her dismissal, Lucas woke up early and put on a simple shirt. He was going to the grocery store to accept the job. When Josephine realized his intentions, she tried to stop him one last time. "Son, please don't do this. We'll find a way. I'll get another job. You keep studying." "Mum, there's no other way." Lucas held her hands, his eyes welling up. "You've worked yourself to the bone your whole life for me. Let me pay you back now, medicine can... Wait, you can't. But before he could leave, the doorbell rang. It was strange, they rarely had visitors, especially so early. Josephine opened the door cautiously and found herself face to face with a woman she didn't know, well-dressed, holding an executive briefcase. "Josephine Miller?" "Yes, that's me," Josephine answered, her heart racing. There was something in the woman's expression that was hard to read. "My name is Adriana Campos. I'm from the Human Resources Department at Thompson Bank. May I come in? I need to speak with you about something urgent." Josephine felt her legs go weak. Was it legal trouble now? Were they coming to formally sue her? Lucas stepped forward, standing protectively beside his mother. Adriana noticed the fear in both their eyes and quickly added, "Please, don't be alarmed. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to bring justice." They sat in the small living room, and Adriana began to explain. Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly woman Josephine had helped, was the mother of the bank's owner. She had told her son everything, and he was shocked and furious about what had happened. A full audit was being organized for that very morning, and Josephine was being invited to attend. Josephine listened in a state of shock. Mrs. Eleanor was the owner's mother, that sweet, humble woman who had talked to her as an equal, who had worried about her problems, who had treated Lucas with such kindness the few times they met, was actually part of the family that controlled the entire institution. "And she told him what happened?" Josephine asked, barely believing it. "She told him everything," Adriana replied with a gentle smile. "And she'll be there today along with Mr. Thompson and the entire board. They want to hear your side of the story. They want to do justice. But only if you agree to go. I know you must be traumatized, that it must be difficult to go back there. But believe me, this time it will be different." Lucas squeezed his mother's hand tightly. "You have to go, Mom. You have to clear your name." Josephine looked at her son, at this boy who had become a man too soon, who was willing to sacrifice his dreams for her, and something inside her, something that had been broken since that terrible afternoon, began to mend. Maybe there was still justice in the world. Maybe there were good people in positions of power. Maybe Mrs. Eleanor was exactly what she seemed, an angel disguised as an old woman sent to show that kindness still existed. "I'll go," she said, her voice firm for the first time in days. "Yes, I'll go." As they prepared to leave, unbeknownst to them in another part of the city, Marcus Slade was having the best day of his week. He had just received an email informing him that he would easily exceed his quarterly targets, which meant a generous bonus. He was proud of himself, of his efficiency, of how he kept that branch running like a well-oiled machine. Victoria was also beaming. With Josephine out of the way, she felt she was finally consolidating her position, showing Marcus that she was a valuable ally. She was already planning the next steps of her corporate climb, imagining herself as a regional manager in a few months. Neither of them had any idea of the storm that was about to break over their heads. Neither of them imagined that this morning, which had started so normally, would end with their careers shattered and their true faces exposed, for all to see. At the bank's headquarters, Robert was gathering the board for an emergency meeting. He presented the information his mother had given him, showed the reports he had hastily compiled on Marcus's branch, and proposed the surprise audit. Some directors hesitated, worried about the public exposure, but Robert was adamant. This was about principles, about honoring his father's memory, about proving that Thompson Bank was still an institution that cared about values and not just numbers. Mrs. Eleanor arrived at the headquarters dressed simply, but there was a dignity in her posture that impressed all the directors. Present. This elderly woman, who spoke in a calm but firm voice about everything she had witnessed, emanated a moral authority that no executive title could confer. One of the oldest directors, who had known Arthur personally, had tears in his eyes as he listened to her. It was as if Arthur himself were there, reminding them why they had gotten into this business in the first place. The convoy of executive cars left the headquarters at 10 in the morning. Robert, Mrs. Eleanor, 5 board directors, the legal team, and Adriana from Human Resources. They traveled in a procession to the branch on Park Avenue, where Marcus Slade waited unknowingly, about to have the most important and terrible day of his career. Inside one of the cars, Mrs. Eleanor held Robert's hand. Mother and son, united not just by blood, but by a common purpose: to bring justice, restore dignity, and honor the memory of a man who had built an empire without ever losing his humanity. Arthur's letter was in Mrs. Eleanor's bag, its words echoing like a mantra. Do not be afraid to bring us back to the path. As the cars moved through the New York traffic, somewhere in that immense city, Larissa woke up with the weight of the most difficult decision of her life. The recordings were saved on her personal computer, the evidence of the truth, of the setup against Josephine, of the calculated cruelty of Marcus and Victoria. She had the power to change everything, to bring justice, but she was also afraid of the consequences. It was a choice between her conscience and her security, between doing the right thing and protecting herself. She looked at the photo of her mother on her bedside table, the woman who had raised her. To be honest, principled, brave. What would she say if she knew her daughter had evidence of a terrible injustice, but was afraid to reveal it? Larissa took a deep breath, grabbed the flash drive where she had saved a copy of the recordings, and made her decision. She would go to the bank that day and hand it all over, no matter what happened. Some things were more important than security, and one of them was being able to look at herself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. New York pulsed with its frantic life that September morning, millions of people going about their routines, each carrying their invisible dramas. But on this specific day, at a specific branch of a specific bank, the truth was about to emerge from the shadows, justice was about to be served, and lives were about to be transformed forever. The storm that Mrs. Eleanor, with her quiet dignity and unconditional love, had begun to form the day she first walked into that bank, was finally about to break with all its force upon those who thought power and arrogance made them untouchable. It was 11 in the morning when the cars pulled up in front of Thompson Bank on Park Avenue. The usual hustle and bustle of the bank continued as normal, customers coming and going, employees busy with their routines. No one noticed anything special about the convoy of executive vehicles parking in a line. No one imagined the earthquake that was about to shake the place. Robert got out first, followed by the directors. Then, with care and attention, he helped his mother out of the car. Mrs. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the same anxiety as that first day, but this time something was different. She was no longer alone. She was no longer defenseless, and most importantly, she was no longer willing to accept injustice in silence. They entered through the main lobby, and it was as if the world stopped for a second. People began to realize who these visitors were, the recognition spreading in waves. Robert Thompson himself, the owner of the bank, accompanied by the entire board of directors. Something very serious was happening. Marcus Slade was in his office when his assistant rushed in, her face pale. "Sir, Mr. Thompson is here with the entire board. They're coming this way." The manager stood up immediately, adjusting his tie, a confident smile forming on his lips. Finally, a visit from the higher-ups. It was his chance to shine, to personally show how he kept that branch running with exemplary efficiency. He walked out of his office with long, confident strides, prepared to impress. But when he reached the lobby and saw the delegation, something in his chest tightened. There was tension in the air, faces that were too serious, an energy that didn't match a congratulatory visit. And then his eyes fell on her. The old woman, that same shabbily dressed woman who had come weeks ago with her absurd stories. What was she doing here next to Robert Thompson? "Mr. Thompson, what a pleasure to have you." Marcus extended his hand, keeping his voice steady despite his growing unease. "If you had let us know, we would have prepared a proper reception." Robert did not take the outstretched hand. His expression was icy, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the manager take an involuntary step back. "Mr. Slade, this is a surprise audit. We will need access to all records, all security footage, all human resources documents from the last 6 months. And we'll start with a meeting now in your office with all the employees of this branch present." The tone allowed for no argument. Marcus felt a cold sweat run down his back, but maintained his composure. "Of course, sir, whatever you need. I'll summon everyone immediately." In the following minutes, employees from all departments were called. Tellers, security guards, administrative staff, everyone gathered in the ground floor meeting area. The murmur of speculation was constant. What was happening? Was someone going to be fired? Was the bank being sold? Victoria Montgomery arrived late, coming from an external meeting. When she saw the commotion, panic began to set in. She searched for Marcus with her eyes, but the manager avoided her gaze, his face tense and pale. Something was very wrong. Robert positioned himself at the front of the room, flanked by the directors. Mrs. Eleanor stood slightly behind, observing everything with the calm that comes from someone who has nothing left to lose. The human resources officer, Adriana, was beside her, and Josephine would soon arrive, having been instructed to enter a few minutes later. "Good morning, everyone," Robert's voice echoed firmly through the room. "I am here today because I have received extremely serious information about the operations of this branch. Information about abuse of authority, harassment of employees, and what is even more serious, a criminal setup for an unjust termination." The silence that fell was absolute. All heads turned to Marcus, who was standing against the wall, his face now completely white. Victoria felt her legs weaken. "A few weeks ago," Robert continued, "a lady came to this branch to make a withdrawal. A simple, routine transaction. But instead of receiving the respectful service that any customer deserves, she was publicly humiliated, ridiculed, accused of being a fraud, and treated as if she had no value as a human being." Robert paused, letting the words sink in. "That lady is my mother, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, widow of Arthur Vance, the founder of this bank." The shock was collective. Faces turned pale. Mouths fell open. Gazes turned to Mrs. Eleanor with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Marcus felt the floor open up beneath his feet. That woman, the woman he had mistreated, mocked, publicly humiliated, was the mother of the bank's owner. "But the story doesn't end there," Robert went on, his voice now thick, with restrained indignation. "An employee of this branch, a woman who worked here for 15 years with exemplary dedication, had the courage to show compassion. She offered a glass of water, showed basic respect. And for that, for this simple act of humanity, she was harassed, slandered, and finally fired under false accusations of theft." At that moment, the door opened and Josephine entered. She was dressed in the most presentable clothes she owned, her hair neatly tied back, but she couldn't hide the signs of recent suffering. Dark circles under her eyes, a thin face from not having eaten properly for days. When her eyes met Mrs. Eleanor's, tears welled up immediately. The two women embraced in the middle of that crowded room, and in that embrace there was shared pain, shared struggle, but also renewed hope. The employees watched in silence, many with tears in their own eyes. They knew Josephine, they knew her character, and many had always known that the accusation was false, but hadn't had the courage to speak up. "Mr. Slade," Robert turned to the manager, who was now cornered both physically and morally. "Do you have anything to say?" Marcus tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat, tried again. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't know who she was. If I had known—" "Oh, so that's the problem?" Robert cut in, his voice sharp. "If you had known who she was, you would have treated her with respect. And all the other people who aren't the mothers of bank owners, they can be humiliated at will." "No, I didn't mean that." Marcus stumbled, searching for words. "I was just protecting the bank's interests, verifying a suspicious situation." "Suspicious?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice cut through the air for the first time. "You called me a freeloader. You said I was making up stories to pull a scam. You humiliated me in front of dozens of people, treated me as if I had no human dignity, and all because I was dressed simply? Because I didn't look rich in your eyes?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus had no answer. There was no possible answer that could justify it. "And as for Josephine," Mrs. Eleanor continued, now turning to the entire audience, "this wonderful woman was fired because you planted money in her bag. Yes, you all heard that right. He planted false evidence to destroy the life of an honest person, a hard-working mother who single-handedly supports a brilliant son who dreams of being a doctor." It was at that moment that the door opened again and Larissa entered. She was nervous, clutching a flash drive with trembling hands, but there was determination in her eyes. She excused herself and went directly to Robert. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Larissa Matthews. I work in the IT department. I have the security footage that proves everything being said here. I have the video of Mr. Slade and Ms. Montgomery entering the locker room and planting money in Josephine's bag. I have everything." The impact was devastating. Victoria, who had been trying to remain invisible at the back of the room, let out a whimper of despair. Marcus opened and closed his mouth several times, like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Robert took the flash drive from Larissa's hands and looked at her with something close to reverence. "Thank you. You have no idea how much courage it took to do this." One of the directors connected the flash drive to a projector, and the recordings began to play on the white wall of the room. Everyone watched in horrified silence as Marcus and Victoria furtively entered the locker room, opened Josephine's bag, put the money inside, and left, looking around to make sure no one had seen them. The evidence was irrefutable, crystal clear, impossible to deny. When the footage ended, Marcus collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. Victoria was crying softly, but no one felt any pity. What they had done was criminal, cruel, unforgivable. "Mr. Marcus Slade," Robert said in a formal tone, "you are terminated with cause, effective immediately. Furthermore, we will be forwarding this case to the proper authorities. You will be held criminally responsible for falsifying evidence, defamation, and harassment. The same applies to Ms. Victoria Montgomery." Security guards were called to escort them both out of the building. Marcus tried to argue. Victoria begged for a second chance, but it was too late. They were led away under the gazes of dozens of employees, many of whom had been victims of their abuse over the years. There was no celebration, but there was a collective sense of justice finally being served. When the room quieted down, Robert turned to Josephine. "Mrs. Josephine Miller, on behalf of Thompson Bank and my family, I offer my deepest apologies for what you have endured. You were the victim of a terrible injustice, and no words can compensate for the pain and humiliation you went through. But we can start by doing the right thing now." Josephine could only weep, leaning on Mrs. Eleanor, unable to believe what was happening. "You are officially reinstated at the bank," Robert continued, "with all rights and benefits retroactive. But not only that, I am creating a new department focused on employee well-being to ensure that no worker here is ever treated with disrespect or abuse. And I would like you to supervise this department, not as a cleaning staff member, but as a supervisor with a commensurate salary and the authority to implement real change." The shock on Josephine's face was total. I don't know what to say. I don't have the training for that, sir. You have 15 years of experience seeing exactly what doesn't work, what hurts, what destroys. That is worth more than any degree, and if you wish to study, the bank will pay for your education." Robert smiled for the first time that morning. "Believe me, you are exactly the right person for this job." Mrs. Eleanor hugged Josephine again, both of them crying now, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of justice restored. Around them, employees began to applaud spontaneously. It wasn't every day they saw good triumph, saw someone like them being elevated, respected, valued. But Robert wasn't finished. He called over Lucas, who had shyly followed his mother in and stood in a corner, witnessing everything with wide eyes. "Young man, I understand you dream of studying medicine." Lucas nodded, still at a loss for words. "Yes, sir, it's been my dream since I was a child. As of today, you have a full scholarship, covering your prep course, college, housing if necessary, and anything else you need until you graduate. It's the least we can do after what your family has been through because of us." Lucas felt his legs give way. His mother held his arm, both of them in a state of total shock. The dream that had seemed dead just days ago was not only revived, but guaranteed. He wouldn't have to choose between helping his mother and studying. He could do both. "And you," Robert turned to Larissa, who was still standing there nervously, "you demonstrated courage and integrity when you could have chosen silence. That is rare and precious. I am promoting you to coordinator of digital security, with a significant raise and the authority to implement protocols that ensure evidence of misconduct is never again ignored or hidden." Larissa began to cry, too. Months of anguish, of ethical dilemmas, of sleepless nights. It had all been worth it. She had done the right thing, and for the first time in a long time, that choice had resulted not in punishment, but in recognition. Robert then asked for the attention of all the employees present. What happened here is a symptom of something larger. This isn't just one branch with problems. It's a reflection of a culture we allowed to develop, where numbers matter more than people, where efficiency is valued above humanity. That ends today. He announced a complete review of all branches, audits throughout the network, the creation of independent reporting channels, and mandatory training on respect and dignity. But more than that, he announced a change in philosophy. Thompson Bank would once again be what Arthur had always wanted it to be, an institution that serves people, not one that exploits them. When the meeting ended and people began to disperse, Mrs. Eleanor was left alone with her son for a few moments. Robert hugged her tightly, the tears finally coming after being held back all morning. "Thank you, Mum, for reminding me of who I'm supposed to be, for not letting Dad's legacy be tarnished by my negligence." "You weren't negligent, son. You were just too busy, as we all are sometimes. But today you showed that when it matters, you choose what's right. Your father would be so proud." In the months that followed, the changes were profound and real. The branch where it all happened became a model for the entire network. Josephine took on her new role with dedication and wisdom, implementing policies that transformed the lives of hundreds of employees. Her story spread, inspiring others to report abuse, to demand respect, to no longer accept the unacceptable. Lucas dove into his studies with renewed dedication. He knew he carried not only his own dream, but also his mother's hopes, Mrs. Eleanor's kindness, the second chance life had given him. He swore to himself that he would become the best doctor possible, that he would use his knowledge to serve those who, like his mother, fought every day just to survive with dignity. Larissa flourished in her new role. She implemented systems that made it impossible to hide misconduct, created protocols that protected whistleblowers, and turned technology into a tool for justice instead of oppressive surveillance. Her mother, upon learning everything, cried with pride for the daughter she had raised to be a person of integrity, who had proven to be just that when it mattered most. And finally, after the storm, the party in honor of Arthur took place, not in the original format Mrs. Eleanor had planned, but as something even more significant. Robert organized a grand event, gathering not only friends and family, but also the bank's employees, especially those whose lives had been touched by the recent transformation. At the party, Mrs. Eleanor gave a speech that left few dry eyes in the room. She spoke about Arthur, about the man of integrity he was, about the values he cherished. But she also spoke about learning that legacies are not immutable statues of the past, but living seeds that need to be nurtured, protected, and sometimes rescued when they are threatened by the weeds of greed and forgetfulness. "My husband always said that a financial institution is not made of money, but of trust. And trust is not built with impressive profits or beautiful buildings. It is built by treating every person, rich or poor, powerful or humble, with the basic dignity every human being deserves." She looked around, her eyes resting on Josephine, on Lucas, on Larissa, on Robert. "Today I see that this teaching has not died. It was merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to flourish again." At the end of that night, mother and son officially inaugurated the Arthur Vance Foundation, dedicated to supporting workers who were victims of injustice in the banking sector. The foundation would offer legal assistance, temporary financial support, scholarships for employees' children, and most importantly, a safe space where victims of corporate abuse could find a voice and justice. Josephine would be one of the foundation's coordinators, using her experience and empathy to help others who had gone through what she had. Lucas, once he graduated, planned to offer free medical care through the foundation. Larissa would develop secure and anonymous reporting systems. All of them, in some way, were transforming their pain into purpose, their wounds into bridges to help others. Mrs. Eleanor, who had spent 3 years sunk in a paralyzing grief, found a new meaning for her life. Not that the absence of Arthur hurt any less, but now that pain had a channel, a way to transform into something productive and beautiful. Every time the foundation helped someone, every time an injustice was corrected, she felt that Arthur was smiling from wherever he was, proud of the woman he had chosen as his partner in life and legacy. Robert, in turn, was also transformed. He continued to run the bank with the same competence as before, but now with a completely different perspective. He began to visit branches regularly, not to audit numbers, but to talk with employees, understand their realities, and ensure that the culture of respect took root in every corner of the institution. He reduced his workload to spend more time with his mother, making up for the years he had been absent due to professional ambition. The story of that transformation spread far beyond the walls of Thompson Bank. Other institutions began to question their own cultures, to review their practices, to realize that motivated and respected employees were more productive than those governed by fear. The change was slow, met with resistance in many places, but it had begun. And all because an elderly woman dressed simply had the courage not to accept injustice, and a son had the humility to listen to his mother and act. As for Marcus and Victoria, they faced criminal charges for their actions. Marcus was convicted and lost everything he had built through questionable methods. Victoria managed a plea deal, but her career in the banking sector was permanently over. Neither of them ever fully understood what they had lost by choosing power and cruelty over empathy and integrity. And so, on a spring morning, almost a year after that fateful day, Mrs. Eleanor sat in her garden, a cup of tea in her hands, and looked around with a serene smile. The mansion was no longer too quiet. Robert came for dinner every week, always bringing news of the transformations at the bank. Josephine and Lucas visited regularly, having become family by heart. Even Larissa would stop by from time to time, seeking advice from the woman who, without knowing it, had changed so many lives by simply refusing to be invisible. Mrs. Eleanor picked up Arthur's letter, which she now kept in a frame in her room, and reread the familiar words. "Do not be afraid to bring us back to the path." She had not been afraid, and in doing so, she had discovered that she had never been so alive, so useful, so connected to the purpose she and Arthur had shared for a lifetime. Appearances were indeed deceiving. Power truly was blinding. But human dignity, when defended with courage and love, had the power to change not only individual lives, but to transform entire systems, to plant seeds of justice that would flourish for generations. And that story, which began with humiliation and pain, ended with hope, transformation, and the certainty that good, when upheld by courageous people, would always find its way to win. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Eleanor, Josephine, and all those who fought for justice has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of resilience, courage, and transformation, please leave a like right now, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our stories, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it Mrs. Eleanor's courage in facing humiliation? Josephine's kindness when everyone else turned their backs? Larissa's dilemma between her conscience and her fear? Or Robert's transformation upon recognizing his mistakes? We want to hear your opinion. Every day, we bring intense and true stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, and reminding us that dignity and justice are always worth fighting for. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on what truly matters in life. See you soon.